Chapter 19 in our History of California addresses the ongoing battle between labor and capital. Still goes on today, but certainly was prominent in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. This was an era of sweeping changes as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Historians call this a period of modernization, which included industrialization and urbanization. Immigration increased in response to increasing economic opportunity, and as a result, the struggle between labor and capital intensified, with new organizations, sometimes radical ones, coming onto the scene demanding a greater share of the benefits of modernization, a bigger piece of that pie. Business certainly dominated, and labor was getting organized at this time. You might recall in previous chapters we talked about Dennis Kearney's Working Men's Party of 1877. That party really didn't do much to advance the concept of the labor organization. It was kind of a flash in the pan and only lasted for a couple of years. And nationally at this time, in the late 1800s, labor was split into two camps. One camp wanted to do just collective bargaining with specific employers for strictly economic goals, and organizations based on local unions by craft. Then those would form national federations. This gave birth to what is called the AFL, or American Federation of Labor, which still exists today. Now it's called the AFL-CIO because two major union organizations actually united. A more radical faction was brewing, which advocated a national union of workers in all crafts, not just specific unions by craft. They advocated the taking over of as many industries by workers as possible, which then produced the Noble Order of the Knights of Labor, and they were quite to the left on the political spectrum, and even to the left of them were the Marxists. So there was some Marxist element in this second faction of people who were trying to organize labor. San Francisco was a place where the unions had their strongest presence and increase in the late 1800s in California. Frank Roney and Burnett Haskell were a couple of players in this. They were prominent labor leaders of the 1880s in San Francisco. Both were socialists. Haskell's biggest accomplishment was the leadership in the founding of the Coast Seamen's Union in 1885. The labor issues were most prominent in San Francisco because, after all, San Francisco was the premier port of the West Coast, and so on the waterfront, this is where labor issues seem to emerge the most. At the time, working conditions in the maritime industry could only be described as atrocious. Here are some examples. Until 1898, corporal punishment at sea was permitted for, quote, justifiable cause, and until 1915, until some reforms were passed, a merchant seaman had no right to quit work, as in other industries. If you quit work as a merchant seaman, you were considered a deserter. So that was quite different from other industries, no question. Here's a picture of Frank Roney on the left and Burnett Haskell on the right. Then there was the infamous crimping system. The crimps were people who were the keepers of sailors' boarding houses on the San Francisco waterfront. They served as the main employment agency for steamship companies. By no means were they official, but you had to go through the crimps. In port, sailors lived on credit advances from the crimps, so it was almost as if the merchant seaman was a slave in some ways, an indentured servant. No sailor could get work on any ship except through the crimps. No ship's master could get a crew for a ship any other way except through the crimps. And the master often had to pay blood money to the crimp in order to keep the crimp from being beat up, keep the merchant seaman from being beat up and thrown on a ship that he didn't want to work on. Haskell's formation of the Coast Seamen's Union in 1885 sought to improve the conditions for the merchant seamen. He was also responsible for forming a utopian colony in the mountains of Tulare County called the Cahuilla Colony. This was to provide work in timber cutting to sailors who were out of work. This colony failed, but Haskell was actually instrumental later on in the foundation of what was ultimately to become Sequoia National Park. That's kind of interesting. The sailors eventually did, though, reject Haskell's socialism and his eccentricity. Then in 1891, the Coast Seamen's Union merged with the Sailors' Union of the Pacific, and the leader of the Sailors' Union of the Pacific was a fellow by the name of Andre Forsyth. Forsyth was involved in the reforms of the Lafayette Seamen's Act of 1915. This was passed in the Senate and in the U.S. House of Representatives. Lafayette was a senator, I think, from Missouri. This Lafayette Seamen's Act of 1915 regulated sailors' working conditions and finally broke the power of the crimps. In this photo, that is a picture in the inset there of Forsyth and his office at Mission and Stewart Streets during the 1901 strike at the waterfront of San Francisco. Now, talking about the hiring of union labor in San Francisco, we talked about merchant seamen, but in other industries, working conditions were harsh as well. This led to the increase in the clout and establishment of labor unions in San Francisco. In the building trades, employers agreed to hire only union members. Now, this is the concept of what we call the closed shop. This didn't exist in any other trades in San Francisco at the time except for the building trades. Employers agreed only to hire union members. So this is the closed shop. However, in most other occupations, this was not the case. There was labor unrest in 1901, as I alluded to in the previous slide, as Teamsters joined with the sailors and the longshoremen in a waterfront strike. And this was important because it shut the prominent port of San Francisco down for several weeks. The political machine in San Francisco at the time assigned the police to protect the strikebreakers. This led to the formation of the Union Labor Party. The unions decided, well, if the city is going to operate this way, we need to get a political party formed so that we can actually get our candidates elected to the leadership of the city of San Francisco. This Union Labor Party, however, had corrupt control of San Francisco for 6 years under a fellow by the name of Abraham Rueff, or Boss Rueff as he was known, and we'll explore that more in Chapter 20. Now, while San Francisco was evolving with the closed shop in the building trades, Los Angeles was the nation's leading citadel for what was called the open shop, in which employers refused to make agreements requiring union membership of their employees, and even refused to bargain with the unions at all. The concept of the open shop was most promoted by LA Times owner and publisher Harrison Gray Otis, who we mentioned before. He was the most prominent leader in the open shop philosophy and printed editorials in his paper reflecting that. In 1890, H.G. Otis wanted a wage cut for his printers because of a down economy. He refused to negotiate with those printers, and he imposed a 20% wage cut on them. And then he hired strike-breaking printers and typesetters in San Diego and paid them the previous union wages he paid his union printers, just out of spite, I suppose, more than anything else, and because he could do it. In 1903 in Los Angeles, the Merchants and Manufacturers Association of Los Angeles, or the M&M as it was called, united with employers who were injured by boycotts, and then they started boycotting employers who negotiated with unions. Citizens alliances formed in cities nationwide to side with businesses to fight organized labor as a result of that. In 1910, the metal workers' trade unions were successful up in San Francisco in getting employers to agree to an 8-hour workday for the metal workers. Then those unions focused their efforts on organizing such efforts in LA to make the employers of metal workers do the same thing down there. By June 1st, 1910, however, the negotiations were going nowhere. The metal workers went on a strike in Los Angeles, and the employers refused to negotiate with the metal workers. As mentioned before, the LA Times had strong editorial stances against the strikers. On October 1st, 1910, the LA Times office was bombed on that morning, October 1st, 1910. Eventually, John J. McNamara and James B. McNamara, who were brothers and officials in the Ironworkers Union, and a guy named Ordie McManigal, he was, I guess, a fellow who knew how to use dynamite. These three were arrested for the crime of bombing the LA Times office on October 1, 1910. This was a stand against organized labor because at the time, actually, quite a bit of the public sympathized with organized labor. But after that incident, organized labor got little sympathy, and the open shop concept dominated Los Angeles for another 30 years after that, till probably about the Depression time. Let's talk a little bit about agricultural labor in California, which we'll explore, of course, when we get to the 1960s with the UFW. At this time, in the late 1800s, more than two-thirds of all the people engaged in agriculture in California were laborers, wage laborers, I should say. The majority of them were immigrants, non-white, and migratory. This is referred to often as California's peculiar institution, and it is often referred to that still today. Here are some of the contributing circumstances to migrant farm workers, wage laborers who were non-white. Large, rich landowners owned a lot of land in California. We're thinking, Southern Pacific, that was one of them. There were seasonal specialized crops like, peaches, plums, nectaries, citrus, that kind of thing. There was the availability in each successive generation of people of some new supply of cheap, almost slave labor. Initially, of course, it was the Spanish exploiting the California Indians. Then it was the Chinese, then it was the Japanese, then it was Asian Indians, people from South Asia. Mexicans and Filipinos came on the scene. Organizing agricultural labor at this time would have been exceedingly difficult even if employers had not been violently opposed to it, which of course they were. Here's a quote from a newspaper, the Kern County Californian, in 1888. Now it's the Bakersfield Californian. You might be familiar with that newspaper. With the Chinese, field hands could be treated like the beasts of the field, and like them be removed by their driver or herders when no longer needed. So that was a pretty good capsulization of how brutal people were treated as migrant farm laborers at the time. Once the Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, Chinese people tended to move from the farms toward the cities to get opportunities in the cities. After the economic panic of 1893, more whites got into field work. They were called fruit tramps, and they often participated in riots that drove Chinese workers from the fields. In the late 1890s, early 1900s, Japanese replaced Chinese in the fields until the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 was passed, and that restricted Japanese immigration. The Japanese, by the way, staged the first successful strikes in the history of California ag labor. That's something interesting to note. Then there were the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was kind of an anarchist labor organization that was founded in Chicago in 1905. The IWW members were first called the Wobblies publicly by Harrison Gray Otis of the Los Angeles Times. The Wobblies were quite far to the left, and they denounced craft unions, trade unions, and advocated one great union for all workers of all sorts in the U.S. They did not exclude any worker because of race, and condemned the aforementioned American Federation of Labor, the AFL, for doing so. They would use sabotage, they would start sympathetic strikes, and use any and all tactics as part of their overall strategy to get workers of all stripes to join them and to get into their cause. In 1909, the IWW successfully fought a ban on public free speech in Spokane, Washington, which was part of their effort to organize farm workers in the Pacific Northwest. In Spokane, they tried to eliminate the right to speak publicly, and the IWW started filling their jails up there. And of course, it ended up being unsuccessful because, after all, we do have the First Amendment. Then, a year later, the Wobblies came to Fresno in 1910 to organize farm workers. Several were arrested for speaking on the streets. That's not illegal unless, you're hurting people or disruptive. Once some of them were thrown in jail for speaking on the streets in favor of the farm workers, more of them from other cities showed up to Fresno for the purpose of filling the jails in Fresno. There was an angry mob against the Wobblies. They burned the Wobblies' tent. They even talked about storming the jail to lynch the prisoners, the Wobbly prisoners. There was a several-month stalemate that ensued. And then finally, a compromise freed the IWW members who were in jail from the jail in Fresno County and permitted them to speak in designated areas. And there was a very famous editorial cartoon regarding the wobbly situation in Fresno. You can see, the Spokane police officer, on the ground here showing a wobbly victory, and then you see the police officer in Fresno. So this was quite prominent at the time in 1910. The Wobblies traveled to farm labor camps elsewhere, specifically up to a town called Wheatland, which is in Yuba County, southeast of Marysville. There was a spokesman by the name of Blackie Ford. He was speaking to Ralph Durst on the Durst Ranch to get better conditions for the workers. Durst slapped Ford in the face. The next day, a deputy fired a shot in the air to sober the mob.